Welcome to our drafting workshop. In this workshop, we're going to begin to shape your first draft of your narrative into the second draft by looking at some narrative techniques that we could use in order to bring your story to life. To prepare for this video, you want to make sure that you have out two things. The first is the draft of your literacy narrative. Make sure that you have access to that first draft because as we walk through this particular workshop, I'm going to ask you to kind of go back and forth between not only your draft, but also your note-taking material. So take out those notes that you took to brainstorm for your literacy narrative because we want to add to them in this workshop. The first thing we want to do is we want to set some goals for this particular workshop. And in order to best look back and see how well we accomplished those goals, I would like for you to write these down in your notes. So by the end of this workshop, you should be able to do a few things. First, identify the specific narrative techniques used to achieve the goals for a narrative. Define the narrative techniques and what they do for your text. Describe the goals for a narrative genre. And then apply the narrative techniques to develop draft number 2. So go ahead and stop this video and make sure that you have these goals written down in your notes somewhere. And give yourself enough room in between the goals so that you can jot down some of the notes. So the first thing we want to think about is how you should shape your literacy narrative. And for that, I want to talk a little bit about what is an essay. When we think of essay, we may think of things just that were bound by academic writing, things that are assigned for you in class. And so we typically attach the word essay to just thinking about the writing that we had to do in a class based on an assignment. But really, an essay is written both in and outside of the classroom. So it is a type of writing. And it's a piece of writing or text that presents the writer's ideas. An essay can be as short as 500 words, or it could also be 5,000 words or more. An essay can come in many shapes and sizes. For this project, our essay is going to be a literacy narrative. And so when we think about an essay, no matter what type of essay it is, we look at it as including really 3 main components: an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. For our introduction in our essay, we want to think about how we're bringing our audience into the story. So an introduction is meant to engage the readers and provide the central point to your narrative. So we want to think about what the central point to our narrative is, and we're going to get to an activity that will help us with that in just a few minutes. The next thing we'll look at is the body of our essay. This includes the multiple paragraphs that shape your story. This is where you decide how to tell your story that supports your central point. You'll look to that first draft to help shape this body of your narrative. And then you have your conclusion. And the conclusion is a way to bring your story to a close for your audience. For us, we might even think about using our story of our literacy, and think about how it has shaped where we are today and where we want to go in the future. So your conclusion might even take on almost a looking forward movement as a way to kind of bring the story to an end, but then look at some of the future impacts of understanding your literacy journey to this point. So when you look at taking this first draft to the second draft, you now begin to think about how you're going to shape this essay to ensure that it does have an intro, a body, and conclusion. Now, one question I often get is, how many paragraphs should it be? Well, I don't know, because I don't know how you're shaping your narrative. What we want to look at instead is what the function of a paragraph in a text is. And for that, I'm going to use a little bit of a metaphor. So just kind of excuse the metaphor for just a second, but I think it will really help us. Because when we think about how many paragraphs, it's more how are you organizing your text? And so we have to think about what a paragraph does. I want to think of paragraphs in this moment as rooms. Each room serves a clear purpose, and the things inside it should help it achieve that purpose. Strong paragraphs are like rooms in a house. Each thing inside develops one specific purpose. So, for example, your kitchen. When we think of a kitchen, we think of anything that has things to do with food. Could be preparing food, could be cooking food, could be microwaving food, could be eating food. And so all the things in that room help to support that one goal. So you have perhaps a microwave, a stove, a refrigerator, a sink, countertops, cabinets to keep your dishes in, maybe a table or some kind of bar to sit at to eat. But all of the things in the room have to do with cooking. Paragraphs are just like that. Strong paragraphs will have one specific purpose, one point that they're trying to get across. And then everything in that paragraph seeks to support that one thing. Now, with a narrative, it becomes a little bit different because you're thinking about movements where you're moving from one idea to the next. When we think about weak paragraphs, I associate these with things like dorm rooms. So when you think of a dorm room, it's one large room or one very small room, rather, that does a lot of different things, right? So you've got your bed crammed in there, your desk, and if you have a microwave or a hot plate, so you're trying to do a lot of things in that one space, which means that you're not really able to develop any one thing. You can't truly develop a kitchen in a dorm room because you're also trying to cram your office space with a desk and your bed space with your bed and your bedroom and chairs to sit on. So weak paragraphs are similar to that. You're kind of throwing out lots of different ideas, but not really developing those ideas to their fullest. So I want us to think about this as you begin to put together, when I say the body of your paragraph, even the intro and your conclusion, but specifically focusing on the body, those multiple paragraphs, you would then develop the body to tell your story, shaping them through this idea of focused paragraphs. So just as you wouldn't keep your bed in a kitchen, you wouldn't have sentences in a paragraph that don't help the paragraph achieve its purpose. So let's take a look at this real quick. What do paragraphs do for us? What do they do for us as writers, and what do they do for our audience? This is an excerpt from that example essay that we took a look at last week. And in it you see visually, how do we know that these are two paragraphs? Well, because we indented the first line of each paragraph. That provides communication to your audience that you've got two things going on here, two paragraphs that all have to do with, and you see that there's a subtitle, The Old Lady in the Room. So let's take a look at these paragraphs, and forgive me, I'm going to read them and then we're going to talk about them a little bit. My first day of class came on a cool January afternoon following an adventurous day with my kindergarten students. Campus looked so different from the last time I had darkened its doorstep. After struggling to park, finding the room, and then sitting in a style of desk I had not seen in quite a while, I was ready to learn. It was a reading theory class. What the hell is that? The professor walks in, does her usual introductions, engages in some introductory activities, and hands us a syllabus. As she threw out a whiteboard full of terms, with which I had no connection, I began to seriously second-guess the decision to pursue this. Combine that with hunger, thirst, and the desire to put my head down and go to sleep, my level of anxiety went through the roof. After breathing through this panic attack, we did a few more onboarding activities, and she sent us on our way equipped with the tools to find, download, and print the necessary research articles and required responses for our next class. So off I went with the absolute determination that despite the overwhelming need to get in my car and never return, I was going to get through this. Once I started, I was going to finish. Straddling my identities as a wife, mother, teacher, and now student felt strange, almost surreal. I left the classroom that evening and drove home to re-enter my other world. Because I live on the opposite end of town from campus, it truly felt as though I were leaving one world for another. It was as if they existed on a parallel plane, with one not meant to interact with the other. That was until it was time to begin the painful process of preparing for the next class. That was the first of many times that both of my worlds not only collided, but in many cases exploded. Because of my lack of student habits at the time, I thought waiting until after tucking children into bed on Saturday evening would be a splendid time to begin this process. However, this scene played out like a comedy of errors, only at the time, not so funny. So what do we see happening here? We've got two paragraphs that basically introduce or tell the story of the old lady in the room regarding her first day of class. So why the two different paragraphs? Well, if you look at that first paragraph, think about what is contained in that paragraph. Everything contained in that paragraph have to do with what was happening in the classroom during the first day of class. What was happening in the second paragraph? Well, still time-wise, technically the first day of class, but now instead of it being inside the classroom, the location has been moved. And she's talking about kind of reflecting on what happened in the classroom and moving into her commute home. She's also using that opportunity in that paragraph to think about what happened as a result of that first day and what was going to happen when she began to attack her first homework assignment. So what we have here is we've got two paragraphs, but if you can see the movement of going from the inside of the classroom to the car ride home. So each paragraph contains ideas that develop those two spaces in time that are being highlighted in the paragraph. And so for a narrative, that really kind of helps us think as you're moving your audience through one space to another. And with a narrative, we really are thinking about kind of time or location shifts as you tell the story. And that'll help us when we think about that idea of focused paragraphs. So now that we have a little bit more understanding of the essay structure and perhaps focused paragraphs, now let's think about the narrative genre, right? We're working in what we call the narrative, and that is a genre. It is a type of writing. It's a well-told story. When we think about the goals of a narrative or what it does, it typically tells a story. Sometimes the story is fiction, sometimes it's nonfiction. Ours is nonfiction because you're giving a story about your lived experiences and what has shaped you as a reader and writer. In other words, what has shaped your literacy? And so when we think of it in those terms, we look at that as the goal of our literacy narrative. We're telling a story about who we are and how we've become the readers and writers that we are right now. So in essence, our literacy identity. And so we began by just jotting down some reflections, right? This is a very reflective essay, and we need to make sure that we have done that reflective work. Because in many cases, we don't always remember some of the things from maybe early in our childhood that would help us kind of reflect on who we are as readers and writers today. So for this piece, we want to pull out that first draft. And if you remember, these are the questions that we did as part of your reflective process. This is what started the generate some ideas, right? And those last four questions: how are your current attitudes, feelings, or stances towards reading and writing? To whom or what do you attribute those feelings? How did you get to where you are as a reader and writer? What in your past has made you the kind of writer and reader you are today? Who are some people in your life who have acted as literacy sponsors? What are some institutions and experiences in your life that have acted as literacy sponsors? Remember from last week, literacy sponsors is anything, any agent, right? Concrete or abstract, local or distant, who has shaped your literacy or impacted your literacy. This means they could have modeled it, they could have encouraged it, they could have withheld it, they could have suppressed it. So when we say impact, it's just who or what has impacted your literacy. Those reflective questions that we saw on the previous screen and that you began to work with last week shaped what you submitted as that first draft. It was a way to flush out some ideas. Now what we want to do is we want to take those ideas and begin to shape what would become our central point. That's that piece that you put in the introduction because it provides your audience with that plot, if you will, for your story. So we want to begin to answer, what is my so what? And so I have framed this thinking around something I call the personal literacy statement. And what I want you to do is I want you to use that first draft, pull that out, make sure you've got that with you. Now, this personal literacy statement is something that takes a little bit of finessing. It takes a little bit of time. And I want you to be patient with yourself in order to kind of bring this into fruition. So I'm going to use mine or something that I developed as a reference or just as an example, but please understand that in order for me to shape my personal literacy statement, it took a little bit. So one of the things I want you to think about, and we're going to walk through a little bit of an activity. How would you describe your literacy identity today? In other words, how would you describe you as a reader and writer? This becomes your central point. In essence, this is the plot of your story. So let's do that by shaping it through a couple of questions. The goal of this particular activity is to begin to think about how you would articulate your personal literacy statement. So let's try this out. The first thing I want you to do is just kind of stop the video and jot down a few adjectives that you would use to describe yourself as a reader and writer. So for example, two of the things that always pop in my head when I think about my own journey with reading and writing are these two things: determined and apprehensive. So stop the video and just jot down some adjectives that you would use to describe yourself as a reader and writer. Now that you have some of those ideas or those adjectives jotted down, the next question is, why is it that you're using those words to describe yourself? Why is it that those words describe you as a reader and writer? So for example, if I use those words determined and apprehensive, I then had to think about why it was that I was using those words to describe my own personal literacy, me as a reader and writer. And so I started to develop my because statement. I would describe myself that way because as a child I struggled with my learning, and it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized why. Now that's really general. However, it does help me begin to flush out. You have some of the experiences through those reflective questions. All we're doing right now is we're thinking about how those experiences can be shaped into a central point that we're calling the personal literacy statement. Now, I'm only calling it this as just a reference point. You don't need to call it that in your essay. You would just shape the essay using that central point. So once you have these two things, you've got how you would describe yourself and you've got why you would describe yourself. Now you can start to play with this. And you can begin to bring together a personal literacy statement. So, for example, when I began to shape my personal literacy statement, I started thinking about how I would want to describe it. I used the metaphor of a roller coaster. So, mine states, as a reader and writer, I am both determined and apprehensive. This paradox has been shaped through a treacherous yet productive roller coaster of experiences, which have taught me that the pages of my literacy storybook will never be full, and as such, I have learned that the journey itself is the destination. So, what you notice here is that I've included how I would describe myself, but then I had to think about what's the connection between these two things. Well, they're kind of a paradox, they're kind of a contrast. And so I wanted to bring about a statement that would guide the audience into what my literacy narrative or the body of my text would be. And that is a treacherous yet productive roller coaster of experiences. So that kind of tells us, right? We have this image in our head. We know what a roller coaster does. It goes up and down and around and upside down and goes fast. Um, it's got it's got highs, it's got lows, and so that's kind of what I'm bringing about in this literacy or personal literacy statement is that my experiences have been shaped by not only a roller coaster but a treacherous yet productive roller coaster. And at the end of the day, I learned that the journey for my learning is the destination. So this particular statement actually took a little bit, but it also boils everything into this one piece that you would put in the introduction before shaping the body of your text, because that's the next piece. So if we've got this personal literacy statement, and again, be patient with yourself, kind of play with it. In just a few minutes, we're going to go through some literacy techniques. Okay, so now let's just say we've got that personal literacy statement. And what do we see? Well, I've said I'm determined and apprehensive. I've got a treacherous yet productive roller coaster. So now I want to think about the experiences that have shaped. Now you have these in your draft, right? You've already started to think about those. But one way to consider how you might shape the body of your text is to go from general to more specific. So when I think about the experiences that have shaped how I describe myself, there's a couple of things that pop up. And so these are general time frame. First, my struggle through high school. That's top of mind for some reason. And my second is my choice to become an educator. When I have these two pieces thought of, now I can start thinking about more specific experiences, because honestly, we've got 1,000 words here. I'm not gonna tell you every experience that I had in high school, and that wouldn't be productive. But what I would want to do is shape the idea of this treacherous yet productive roller coaster through perhaps specific experiences that I felt were most impactful. So now that I have this idea of, okay, I've got this time frame, high school, now I can think of one or more experiences that I would want to bring up or to shape into my literacy narrative. And for me, I can remember a time when my algebra teacher could not understand why I was struggling so much with a concept. He kept explaining it the same way over and over, not realizing that I needed him to connect the concept with me in a different way in order for it to make sense. Looking back on this, I realized that this was one of the moments that drove my decision to teach. And part of that was, as I look back, I could see that my instructor at the time did not know how to differentiate instruction to connect to me. And so it's only in a time of reflection that I realized that this was a very impactful moment for me. So my next general time frame was becoming an educator. And then a more specific memory that I might bring forth in the narrative is going to grad school later in life. Remembering that first day of school, how much I struggled with the learning that I needed to do. So again, what we have here is we've shaped our personal literacy statement, and then use what you have in your draft to start thinking about how your personal literacy statement will be brought to life through the body of that narrative, the body of the text that's going to speak to this central point. So let's now think about some narrative techniques that you might use as you begin or continue to shape your essay. And in this case, we want to think about how we would show our story. In a narrative, the well-told story, we really want our audience to experience the story with us. And so we want to talk about two things, and there's a million things you could use, lots of narrative techniques. But we're going to focus on two that I believe are: one, these are things that we use in our own conversation all the time, and two, these are the things that you most often see, let's say, in a narrative. The first one being figurative language, and the second one being dialogue. So, what is figurative language? Figurative language is phrasing that goes beyond the literal meaning of words to get a message or point across. For example, in my personal literacy statement, I said that I was shaped through a treacherous yet productive roller coaster. Well, I'm using a metaphor. I'm comparing my reading and writing to a roller coaster in order for my audience to connect so that they can understand what I mean about my literacy. And we use figurative language for multiple reasons. It engages the reader better, creates a mood, paints a picture with words. It can develop characterization, advance a plot, and really enhance everyday language. We use figurative language in our natural conversation. And there's multiple ways that you can use figurative language. Figurative language is the umbrella term that says, I'm saying something that goes beyond the literal meaning. So let's look at this. The golden yellow sunlight filtered down through the pale new leaves on the oak trees, coming to rest on Jessica's brown toes that were splayed in the red Georgia mud. So the writer here wants you to see this image, because the writer could have simply said, Jessica was sitting in the woods. However, instead, what the writer wanted to do was have you see what was happening. The golden yellow sunlight filtered down. We get this idea of filtered, where you see the sunlight and it is being filtered through the trees, coming to rest on Jessica's brown toes that were splayed in the red Georgia mud. So this idea of you can see those toes spread out as it sits in the red Georgia mud. So the author, the writer of this, really brought some language into it so that the audience could experience it. Here's another one. In the hard-packed dirt of the Midway, after the glaring lights are out and the people have gone to bed, you will find a veritable treasure of popcorn fragments, frozen custard dribblings, candied apples abandoned by tired children, sugar fluff crystals, salted almonds, popsicles, parsley gnawed ice cream cones, and wooden sticks of lollipops. So this is an excerpt from Charlotte's Web. And so, again, the writer is trying to paint the picture here. What do we see? Well, the Midway is another name for a fair. So we see this is happening at the end of the day. And the writer really paints a picture of kind of chaos, right? That the Midway is a mess. It's got popcorn everywhere. It's got, and she calls it a veritable treasure, right? Of popcorn fragments, frozen custard dribblings. So in essence, you can see the evidence of the fun that was had during the fair. So once again, instead of just saying the fair at the end of the day was a mess, the author really wanted to bring this story to life by adding some of this figurative language, this descriptive language, to paint the picture. So in essence, we're moving from telling a story to showing a story. So let's take a look at this example. One time I got a C on my report card, probably because I had been daydreaming in class instead of doing my work. I started crying and almost threw up. The C really stood out because it was written in red ink while all the A's and B's were in black. I just knew my parents were going to be upset. I'd be grounded for sure. There's nothing wrong with this story. The story tells you something. What we want to do is think about how we could take this idea of telling and switch it to showing. With the neatly folded crisp report in hand, she hesitantly unveils the evidence of her afternoon daydreams. Etched in red ink, the C boldly sits among the list of A's and B's, scribbled in lighter and finer black lines. A tear simmers in the corner of her eye. Knowing the doom that lies before her, she fights the vomit creeping up her throat, ready to spill into the freshly vacuumed carpet. The wardens at home would surely punish her. No activities, no phone, no life. She might as well be locked behind ironclad bars. Her life as she knows it is over. So it's the same exact story, but what do we notice? We notice that in this second one, in the show part, that the writer really wants you to see and feel what is happening in the story. So she uses things like etched in red ink. When we think of etched, we think of statues, right? Things that are etched in the statue. It's carved in the statue, this idea of permanency. It's never going away. Instead of saying she was crying or she was about to cry, she describes what that is, or what that is in that moment. A tear simmers in the corner of her eye. So instead of leaving it to the audience to kind of envision what the crying in that moment meant, she describes it. Look at the phrase that describes that she was about to throw up. She fights the vomit creeping up her throat, ready to spill into the freshly vacuumed carpet. Again, she's pulling the audience into the experience so that you can feel it with her. Let's take another example. In this image, many of you are probably very familiar with it, the Harry Potter, where they're in the sorting hat, and Hermione's sitting there with the sorting hat on. And so we can kind of think about what might have been going through her mind. And we can do that through creating somewhat of a narrative. So think of it like this. Seriously, I'm sitting here with this crazy old hat on my head awaiting my fate. How can this hat possibly understand me? How can it look into my soul and decide with one word who I will call my friends? Please, please, please don't pick Slytherin. That house is not me. It's not who I am. Oh gosh, I feel my palms sweating and my heart is beating out of my chest. Wait, is it normal to hear your heartbeat in your ears? Yikes, maybe I am having a heart attack or something. The weight of 1,000 stairs is beginning to make me feel as though I am going to fall through the floor. Gryffindor, what? Oh my gosh, it worked. The sound of that one word from this hat has just made my year. Now I'm tired. So this is just kind of a quick activity. If we take an image and you kind of think about what's the story here? How would you tell that story, right? So we notice that in this particular case, it's being told as if it were happening right in that moment, which you could completely do in your own narrative. It's told in the first person, which your narrative should be in the first person because it's about you. This writer decided to bring things into the present tense so that the audience could experience as if it were happening right then. That could be a complete choice that you might make. Notice it's very descriptive. So it's not just telling that she's sitting there waiting to hear which house she was put in, but she's describing how it felt, what her inner monologue might be doing at the time. So when we think about employing some figurative language, we can think about a couple different types. Again, these are things we use a lot. The first two are metaphor and simile. They work the same way. They're basically trying to take two unlike things and comparing them. My literacy and a roller coaster, bringing them together. And it really begins to paint a picture. Words are the weapons with which we wound. We're comparing words with weapons. So what does that mean? Well, it basically means that words can hurt. Her eyes were fireflies. Were they really? No. The writer's trying to get across that that her eyes were very bright. They almost flickered. They were so happy. Okay. So again, metaphor, and the same thing with simile. Comparing two unlike things in order to really connect your audience to what you're talking about. Cute as a kitten. The guy is as nutty as a fruitcake. And in the image on the right, snoring like a log. Okay, so simile and metaphor are two different types of figurative language that you might bring into this. Hyperbole is another. Now, hyperbole is something that we all use. When you think about that over-exaggeration of anything. I'm trying to solve 1,000,000 issues these days. Are you really? No, but it probably feels like that during certain times of the semester. That there's so much going on and you're trying to navigate the whole thing. So how do we communicate that? We communicate that by over-exaggerating so that we really bring forth the audience's understanding of how we're feeling at the moment. Personification. We see this a lot in fairy tales. Actually, it's one of the conventions of fairy tales. This idea of bringing human qualities to things that aren't human. The stars dance playfully in the moonlight. Stars aren't really dancing. However, we get an image in our mind of what that might look like because we understand dancing. So those lights are kind of flickering around and it looks like they're moving about and dancing playfully. The first rays of morning tiptoed through the meadow. Well, they didn't really tiptoe literally, but what does that mean? It means that they're filtering down slowly, quietly bringing up the morning sunshine. So when we think about these different things that we might use, and again, there's no checklist here. These things will start to come naturally as you begin to bring that story to life. Onomatopoeia is another one. These are just words of a natural sound. So if I say slam the door, we have an understanding of what that sounds like. You're describing the sound. Something went splat. I always think of dropping an egg from a roof, splat. So onomatopoeia, again, is just another way to kind of bring those stories to life. Let's talk for a couple minutes about this next, the narrative technique number 2, which is the dialogue. So this is when a writer includes the actual conversations. And writers use this to advance the plot, reveal true thoughts or feelings, show specific reactions in the moment. It's used strategically because just like you wouldn't probably in a conversation with someone tell every single thing that was said in a story from beginning to end, you would choose certain dialogue that is impactful to your story. So just like any of the other techniques, you're using it strategically. You're using it rhetorically. So what does it do for your story? So for example, this is a little bit of dialogue from one of the books, Hunger Games. And it says, "Handsome lad like you, there must be some special girl. Come on, what's her name?" says Caesar. Peeta sighs. "Well, there is this one girl. I've had a crush on her ever since I can remember, but I'm pretty sure she didn't know I was alive until the reaping." Sounds of sympathy from the crowd. Unrequited love they can relate to. She have another fellow?" asked Caesar. "I don't know, but a lot of boys like her," says Peeta. "So here's what you do. You win, you go home. She can't turn you down then, eh?" says Caesar encouragingly. "I don't think it's going to work out. Winning won't help in my case," says Peeta. "Why ever not?" says Caesar, mystified. Peeta blushes, beet red, and stammers out, Because she came here with me." So think about why the writer might use this dialogue in that moment. Because of the impactful moment of realizing that these two people are now going to have to compete against each other. So where Peeta's had a crush on her, he now realizes that he's being put in a position where it's either going to be her or him that makes it out alive. So winning's not going to help. And so the writer put this in there because it was an impactful moment and it gets across the feelings that Peeta has at this moment. So let's take a little bit of time here and I want to reflect back on the goals. And I realize we spent a lot of time with the figurative language and the dialogue was a little bit shorter, but I want you to walk away with kind of feeling like all of these things that you put into the body of your text are different techniques that you might use to bring your story to life. So I want you to go back to the learning outcomes that we looked at and jot down a few reflections. Do you understand the goals of a narrative? Can you define not only what figurative language is, but why writers use it? Are you able to list and define 2 types of figurative language? What is dialogue and why do writers use it? And then think about in what ways does this information help you as you draft your essay. Take a few minutes, this is going to be important, and reflect on your understanding of what this workshop that you just watched did. Now, let's think about the goals for the second draft. You're going to use your first draft and what you understand about essay structure and begin to develop or shape your literacy narrative in the following ways. First, shape the body of your narrative using descriptive language that allows your audience to experience your story. Develop your conclusion by connecting your literacy experiences to today. In other words, think about how your past impacts not only your present, but also your future. Before doing any of those two things, though, develop your introduction that engages the audiences and brings them to your central point. So remember, go back, shape your personal literacy statement, and then think about an introduction that will engage the audience and bring them to that central point before getting into the body and, of course, the conclusion. So now it's time for you to take that first draft and evolve it into that second draft, thinking about not only the essay structure, but also some of the different techniques that we've discussed during this workshop. Remember, just keep writing. Thanks for watching. Please refer back to this video anytime that you need a little refresher, and I look forward to seeing you online.